Hey, this is Jody Vesley. Welcome to the Heartway Pastor and Missionary Caregiver Podcast. We are going to today wrap up finally this season on church hurt. And today we're going to discuss preventing church hurt. It's been a season for us lately. We went on some trips overseas to do some mission work. We did some mission work in different places of the States as well. So we've been like 5 weeks really of travel, and in the midst of all that, our daughter broke her leg and needed surgery. So it's been a crazy summer for us. Thankfully, at this point, I think it's winding down, so we are ready actually for that. And so I'm excited to finish this series. I think next series we'll go back to a discussion with my wife and I. Several have said that they really enjoyed that, hearing multiple perspectives, and I think that's awesome. I'm a huge proponent of hearing lots of different viewpoints on different issues, and so I think we might try to do that, and it's funner for me anyways, rather than just talking to my computer. Anyways, let's get into this, preventing church hurt. So obviously, right, we're not going to be able to prevent all hurt in our church, and we're not going to be able to prevent all hurt toward us in a church. However, we can and should take steps to help minimize the chance of church hurt and the severity of it. My wife does crisis management planning and helps churches and church staff and missionaries set up crisis management plans, and that can even include when a staff member suddenly dies, or when there's moral failure in a church, or when there's some massive world event and it affects the church. Hint, hint, COVID, right? And so it's just taking steps toward being prepared so that we can make sure we are doing what we should be doing as Christians, and thinking and being prayerful and seeking out God's will when things go badly. And so hopefully this episode today can help you better prepare to minimize the effects of church hurt and maybe even prevent some of it. So let's get into it. So first off, we need to make sure we're choosing biblical leadership as a church, right? Now, depending on your government structure of your church, you may not get a choice in choosing that next leader or one of those leaders in your church, but you can choose whether you follow them or leave or not. If you do stay, you should follow them as long as it's in with biblical boundaries. And if they aren't leading biblically, then you should follow the biblical precedents that we have in Matthew, when someone offends you, going to them directly and then bringing others and then bringing it before the church, making sure you do the log work, as we've discussed many times before that, and prayer before that, to prepare for that discussion, and not just doing it in an emotional way and not a prepared way. And because it is a big deal, because someone who's a leader in your church is most likely that's their livelihood as well. So it's huge. It's a big deal to step into a leadership role in a church and to leave a leadership role in a church. So, as I have mentioned in previous episodes in this season, Mars Hill Church, that church that no longer exists, but it was a mega church in Seattle, multi-site church there. And there's a woman there her name was Wendy Alson. Now many years after this, she lives in another part of the country. Was previously a member of that church, an involved member, and now she attends a small small church plant in another part of the country. And she said this about her experience there under the leadership of Mars Hill, which no longer exists, and really just went very, very badly. She says, I simply have maturity and wisdom now about what kind of leader to look for that I didn't have years ago. I used to be enamored by dynamic preaching and fast growth. Those things make me nervous now. I have no use for big Sunday morning productions and can barely stand to be a part of them anymore. Wow. So, I mean, she grew, right? She got some wisdom now from that experience. So she did learn, and now she knows of some things to look out for, to not get so caught up in the speaking or the fast increase of people in your services. Looking out for our worship time becoming more of a production than maybe a time of worship. And so these are things now that it looks like she's learned in knowing what to watch out for in a church from leadership. So she can now be a part of, depending on the structure of where she's at and in future places, to be a part of a church that has that sort of leadership or not, or to encourage or discourage that type of leadership where she serves. For survivors of church hurt, it can also help to remember that our sensitivity and discernment can actually serve the mission of the church in the long run. So that's very helpful, right? You can help the church as people now with more wisdom, like Wendy in this case. From a Christianity Today article, one man who had been through a corrupt pastor's financial misconduct and abuse of power before resigning from his position said, I no longer automatically trust or respect anybody just because they have a title, position, or influence. And now he's attending a new church, and he remains hyper vigilant for signs of power abuse. It's important to remember who's the real head of the church, right? It's Jesus, and his suffering was more than any of our suffering can even compare to. But also, he can relate to any suffering we might go through in churches. He was tortured by religious people. He was crucified by religious people, and so keep that in mind, right? Sometimes the worst hurt comes from people that say they believe that are in our churches. Let's think biblically about this. In his letter to the Colossian church, which was, by the way, under attack from false teachers who preached a different gospel, Paul affirmed that Christ is the head of the body, the church, right? He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. And so survivors know better than most that not everything that happens in a church reflects Jesus's character and authority. But remembering that, again, Jesus is the head of his church offers us clarity and perspective on the actions of our local body of believers. It's okay to have hypervigilance, hyper-awareness of bad shepherds. This hyper-awareness shows a longing that we have for good shepherds, right? We're trying to keep out bad shepherds and or to see bad shepherds repent and not just continue that way. And it's because we have a longing for good shepherds and ultimately the good shepherd, right? And so to help prevent church hurt. You keep abusive leaders from gaining a position of power. So look at character over competency. Look at teamwork over hierarchy. Look at if they value accountability over secrecy. What are these values from these leaders? Is it more character over competency? I mean, look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, right? When you start looking at those qualifications of church leaders, you see above reproach, right? The husband of one wife, self-controlled, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an able teacher, not addicted to wine, not a bully, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not greedy, one who manages his own household competently, having his children under control with all dignity, right? He must not be a new convert, right? Or he might become conceited. He must have a good reputation among outsiders, right? And so when you look at this, it's more about character than anything. And yet, oftentimes, churches will not really take the time they need to before calling a new pastor to pastor their church. Usually they base it more on the things that are actually kind of red flags, right? Like dynamic preaching, just being a smooth talker, having a smooth tongue, right? This should show us that we need to make sure we're taking adequate time with these potential church leaders before calling them into these positions, really seeing, do they meet these character roles or not? And you're not going to be able to tell that likely in a quick meeting with them on 1 or 2 Sundays during service, right? It can be masked very well by the potential pastor. Also, in preventing church hurt, it's important to create and stick to biblical yet realistic expectations from churches and church leadership, right? So sometimes we begin to set ourselves up for pain and disillusionment in our love for our church and in a holy regard for those who lead us in church. And we forget sometimes the nature of humanity. We're not surprised by evil pressing in from outside of the church, but we are usually blind to the potential for wickedness that's in our own souls, it's in our own churches. We forget that humans are a combination of greatness and grief, of righteous might and disgusting sin, right? And the righteousness in us is Christ in us, right? If we have Christ. So it's not even us righteous, it's Christ in us. So sometimes in our sentimentality about our church and those we love in it, we forget to stand guard against the natural failings of humanity. We turn off our deflector shields, we cast aside our filters, and we begin to ignore the signals of that our inner radar may be sending. And this comes from the book by Stephen Mansfield, Healing Your Church Hurt, which is a really good book that I would recommend if you're trying to heal and recover from church hurt. It's better to know people for the cruel beings they are than to love them despite that we are inherently evil and wicked, than to love others as we hope and wish them to be, and then constantly be disappointed and hurt. So don't think like, oh yeah, I've found the perfect pastor or the perfect church. There's no such thing as either. All right, so I'm just going to tell you that now. There's no such thing as either of those, and it makes me cringe a little bit when I hear someone puffing up some church or some leader or even me, and I don't do well with that when people are like trying to puff me up, because I understand that I am with fault. I understand that they don't see the struggles in me that I deal with, and so I don't want to make them feel like, oh, I'm some kind of elite person. I went to a church one time where a guy called me apostle, and I was like, no, that's not what I am. I'm not that. I'm just like you. I'm just called to serve in this way. And that was when I was a missionary doing deputation fundraising around the different churches before going on the field. And that was a really weird situation. But sometimes people do that, and we need to not do that. We need to understand that from the Bible that churches are not perfect, right? The church in Corinth, it was a church, it wasn't perfect, had lots of problems. Church leaders, not perfect, right? The only one perfect, Jesus. Also, in preventing church hurt, know your boundaries. Know your boundaries. Take assessment, take note to how others respond to your boundaries. Someone may be testing it or pushing it, or they may even cross it to see how you respond, right? See if they can abuse you, to see if they can manipulate you. There may come a day when you need to leave your church, right? And have you defined that? Is the church doctrinally sound? Do they strive to follow and teach and obey the Bible? Is there abuse there? Especially like where you're not safe, or someone in your family isn't safe. That could be toward you, or abuse toward you or to someone else. Have you defined what these unadjustable boundaries are, to where when you would need to leave? And it's important to do that, like prepare that, you know. For me, I'll just be honest with you. If like salvation is the key doctrine, right? So that really takes care of a lot of stuff. Is salvation through Jesus alone? Is salvation something that can be lost? Is our works required for salvation? Like, do you need to do something to earn your salvation? And so, like, when you start answering these questions, like, that really separates a lot of churches, and to me, those are non-negotiables. The answers to those are non-negotiables, and so. But for you, it could be some other things as well. But you need to define what those are, make sure they're biblical. I think abuse should be a no-brainer, right? Sometimes we think of abuse as just the physical sense, and of course, in that way, that needs to be dealt with. If you can deal with it and stay in the church, I mean, that would be ideal. If it's not possible to do that, then it would require leaving. But also emotional abuse, spiritual abuse. These are types of abuse you can look out for as well, and you should. And so, at what point is too much? And before I keep going in this, I do want to sit on this a little bit, because just like it happened in Mars Hill, I see it even now happening in churches, where someone sets a boundary, but it's not a very strong boundary, and they're not very passionate about it. Maybe they haven't even defined it, right? And they don't realize it's a boundary, but when that boundary gets crossed, right, it could be a bit like a lot of times inappropriate, something inappropriately said, right? Something inappropriately done or inappropriate touch, right? You know it, right? You recognize it. That wasn't appropriate. That wasn't biblical. That wasn't right. And a lot of times, instead of doing something about that, responding to it, dealing with it, nothing is done, and then it happens again, but maybe even to a greater degree, and then something else to a greater degree, and then something else and something else, and you have this snowball effect, and suddenly you have Mars Hill just at the peak of when it was its worst, right? And so there's no church immune from something like that happening, where things just go out of control. There's spiritual abuse coming from the highest level to other levels of leadership and just all throughout the church, and it's just a giant mess, right? And at that point, the hurt is so extreme, because every time those things happen and you don't deal with them, right, that's hurt. Hurt that's not being dealt with, and it should be dealt with. It should be dealt with. And so if you're feeling constantly uncomfortable, and any time you feel uncomfortable, I mean, do the log work, check it biblically, and deal with it. I mean, if you're like, when you look biblically and you're like, yeah, this is an issue, and you know it's an issue, you need to deal with it. Don't just let it go unaddressed. Don't let these leaders and others in the church go without accountability, even if, because what happens is that it spreads, right? That abuse spreads to others. Like, not only are others being abused, but others are in a situation now. If they've seen someone do it, they may, especially a leader, they think, oh, this is okay. This is okay to do, and then it just becomes a giant mess. And culturally, especially if you're from the south part of the U.S., like I am, I don't consider myself very much a cultural Texan, even though I was born and raised here. A lot of people are afraid to address things like this. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to seem like someone that's causing issues, and they're trying out of their way to not be a Karen. They're not wanting to ruffle feathers, right? And they don't want to stick out. But sometimes you need to stick out, right? Biblically, you need to stick out. And so I want to encourage you to not let the abuse go without dealing with it. Know your boundaries, recognize them, write them down. Write them down. Don't just, what would it take for somebody said, let's say a sexual joke, right? A sexual joke at a church function, and it's someone in leadership, right? Even if it's not the pastor, so to say, just someone in leadership makes a sexual joke, maybe even about you, and it makes you very uncomfortable because you realize it's not right, it's not appropriate, it's not biblical, it's not moral, it's not good, it's not what we should be doing. It's very inappropriate, and it should not be happening in a church. It shouldn't be happening anywhere, but definitely not going unaddressed in a church. And so that kind of stuff happens quite often in different circles. And so you have to know, like, how am I going to deal with that? That should be a boundary you have, and you should be able to deal with it. If somebody ever, as a as one of the pastors on staff at the church I'm at now, Horizon, if somebody came to me about something like that, I would take it very seriously, and I would help them navigate through it with this individual. We would not be accepting of sexual jokes that are making people in our church feel uncomfortable, that are inappropriate. That's not what we do here. And so that doesn't reflect Christ, and we're not going to allow that in the environment where people come to heal in their faith and to grow in their faith and to serve together in their faith. You can't do that in that kind of environment, and so it needs to be dealt with. That's enough of that. But I wanted to show how serious it is here to know your boundaries. You know, there's an intriguing verse in the Bible that describes the way that Jesus viewed us. And when you read it, at first it may seem like kind of cold, kind of cynical, but we can learn about Jesus and get a really good insight into the nature of his love. So John chapter 2, verses 24 through 25 describe the moment after Jesus had done amazing miracles at the Passover feast, when many people were putting their faith in him. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them. And because he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, because he knew what was in a man. If we didn't know any better, it would be easy to jump to that conclusion that Jesus was cold and self-protective. We can imagine him looking at his disciples with a wary eye, wondering inwardly what deceitful thing they could do next. He would maybe doubt any kind words spoken to him and just seem detached, seem unfriendly, and that would repel people around him. But this isn't the Jesus we know. So let's look at that verse again. When the word entrust comes from the root of the word that means faith. In other words, that verse might read, Jesus did not put his faith in man. In other words, he did not depend on man. He didn't need their assessment of him, rise or fall based on their view of who he was, right? He knew all men, knew what was in a man. So he did not base his life on what men said about him. He was a man with a clear sense of self and a clear sense of destiny, and these were unaffected by anything men had to say about him. Yet to get a full picture, right, we have to remember that Jesus loved people perfectly, right? Us people, right? Deeply flawed beings upon whose words he did not rely on and in whom he did not put faith because he knew what was in us, right? These are the very people he died for, right? The very ones he loved. So, without reservation, that he endured the shame of the cross for all of our sakes. This is the key, right? This is how we do it, how we live in a church of fallen, desperate people, and we love them completely. We love as Jesus loved. We knew what was in our heart. He knew what was in our hearts. He knew the evil. He knew the fantasies and wickedness that circles around like sharks in our souls. He did not base his life, his sense of self or sense of purpose on people's words or admiration. Still, he perfectly loved those he interacted with and even enjoyed them, right? And again, this comes from that Healing Your Church Hurt book by Stephen Mansfield. He has a beautiful way of putting some of these things about the love of Jesus. So to what point are you going to trust someone? Will you speak to them? Who will you speak to? When will you speak to them? We should be willing to trust others, but sometimes that trust has to be earned, right? And so, we're to forgive others, constantly, but that doesn't mean we have to trust them constantly, right? We can trust them with reservations and slowly trust more and more and more. And some people who have been through church hurt, they might just not want to trust anyone. Well, that's not to the point we're supposed to go to, but really we need to understand that we're all sinners, right? Even Jesus viewed us that way. And so trust someone, but don't put your full faith in them, right? At the best point. Okay. Also, in preventing church hurt, listen to and consider the ones who are making claims of hurt in your church. So don't wait for more hurt to be done. Take every claim seriously and deal with it as it needs to be dealt with. Don't cover things up. Don't be involved in that, which happens so much. Also, in preventing church hurt, think about your security systems, procedures. Do you have procedures like 2 adults with children? No guy and woman alone together in a room? Think about background checks. Think about training for volunteers. There's resources out there like Ministry Safe that can be helpful. Our church even has cameras in place as an additional level of just security. I'm not going to tell you what to do here, but there's some good practices you can put into place to help prevent church hurt. Also, talk through problems early. Don't let them develop, grow. Don't let that hurt spread in you and to others. Talk through problems early. Also, in preventing church hurt, be the church, right? Do what you need to be doing, what you should be doing. Be active in the Great Commission. Be an actual functioning member of the body of Christ in that role. Don't sit back and be uninvolved and not being obedient to what you should be doing in a church, right? Because then you're going to be contributing to church hurt by even indirectly causing other people to oftentimes have to overwork in their roles for the church to do what it should be doing, right? And so, lastly, in this, in preventing church hurt, think through church structures. How is your church structured? How are decisions made? A lot of this is already set up when you go into a church somewhere, but make sure that you don't have that structure that it's like, I hate to say this, but you're like putting all your faith and confidence in one man, and there's really no accountability to that man other than that man to God. Because if that man is wicked and evil, or even if he's not intended to be, inherently he is, it would be beneficial to have more accountability for him than just him being more alone in that, and his decisions not being double checked and tested. And he needs to have other mature people in the faith around him, challenging him, holding him accountable. Check for that, make sure that that's there, and you don't have this like, 1 or 2 people in charge with no accountability and making all the decisions. It doesn't even have to be, a pastor. Sometimes it can just be like a church treasurer or a deacon or a prominent family in the church. Try to avoid that, right? Don't put yourself in those situations. Put policies and procedures in place to even prevent those things from developing. We, at our church, we have it to where in any committees, any teams, like you're going to have to rotate off after a couple years so you don't develop that, mindset of, one of the reasons for that is so you don't, we prevent people from getting in those positions of like, oh, I'm making all the decisions and becoming unbiblically powerful in the church. Okay. So, again, this is important, preventing church hurt. Be mindful about it. Think about it. I'd love to hear any thoughts or additional comments or ideas you have in this as well. Never hesitate to reach out to me about anything. Best to do that at my email address, jody@heartwaycare.org. Again, until next time, this is Jody, and this is the Heartway Pastor and Missionary Caregiver podcast, where we seek to help with issues at the source.